Now, a lot of people are probably wondering why it was an all-black battalion. And you got to realize that back then in Canada, yes, people in Canada, most of Canada was segregated. There was a lot of racism in Canada. And so there were a lot of places in Canada where a black couldn't go to restaurants. They couldn't go to some schools. They couldn't go to certain churches. They couldn't even be buried in certain cemeteries. And so when the government finally, they were under so much pressure, and this was another thing. My great uncle was instrumental in changing the views and the attitudes of the Canadian government. He spearheaded a movement to get the Canadian government to change their ways. He wrote letters to then Prime Minister Robert Borden to ask him to force the military to accept blacks. Because what was happening was that black men were turning up at recruitment offices and wanted to join, and they were turned around and turned away simply based on the color of their skin. And a lot of people don't understand that people of African descent have been in this country for hundreds and hundreds of years. So when the First World War broke out in 1914, there were black men living in Canada whose families had been there for generations, some as long as 200 years. And so they...
And that's also your family too, right? Your family's also been in Canada for several generations, right?
Absolutely. I'm a fifth generation African Canadian. And so when the First World War broke out, these black men wanted to fight for their country. They wanted to fight for the country because they felt that they were Canadians. They'd been here all their lives, and their parents have been here all their lives. And so there was a loyalty, but they were refused. And so my great uncle, William White, he was instrumental in spearheading that movement to get it to change. So now when the Canadian government decided, okay, we'll allow them to join, then they realized something. They said, well, wait a minute. These black soldiers, they can't sleep in the same barracks as white soldiers. The white soldiers wouldn't have it because Canada was a segregated
all-black battalion.
Canada was a segregated society back then. So they said, you know what? We'll make it an all-black battalion with white officers, and we won't make them a fighting unit because, again, if they were a fighting unit, they would be in the trenches with the white soldiers. So they said, we'll make it a construction battalion. And so their job was they were assigned to the Forestry Corps of the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the First World War. And their job was, as the part of the Forestry Corps, was to cut down trees, make it into lumber, send them to the sawmills, and then they would build huts, and they would dig trenches for the white soldiers. They would lay barbed wire. And they did this in exposure to enemy fire. So their lives were at risk while they were digging these trenches and laying barbed wire.
Well, it's interesting because I don't know that a whole lot changed between World War I and World War II. As you know, in World War II, my grandfather, my kid's great-grandfather, migrated from the British West Indies, Barbados, to Canada, trained in Farnham, Quebec, and then was a private in the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps. Again, probably in the capacity of a service engineer, building things, moving supplies, so on. I don't know that he ever actually carried a weapon, although he did die in France. But I don't know how much changed between World War I and World War II, but I know that there were black soldiers that also served in World War II in a service corps capacity.
Yes, that's a good point, Sean, because very little change, because African Canadians experienced the same kind of discrimination in World War II. Black men weren't allowed to join the Air Force. And the Air Force during World War II eventually allowed blacks to join. But at the beginning, they were refused. And, during the First World War, there were a few blacks who managed to get in. But that's only because the supervising recruitment officer at the recruitment, at that particular recruitment office, decided to allow that black person to come in and join. But those were very, very few. The majority of black men were simply told, it's a white man's war, go home.
Go home. Well, interestingly enough, I interviewed Kathy Grant a number of months ago. It was during the Memorial Day weekend back in May. And as you know, Kathy Grant has done a lot of grueling work sifting through old photographs, old documents, and specifically for Black Canadian veterans. Her father, Owen Rowe, was one of the few Black pilots in the Canadian Air Force, also originally from Barbados, but to your point, there weren't very many.
It's an important history lesson, because Canadians got to realize that the Black community in Nova Scotia, where the Black Battalion was formed, that is the oldest community in Canada, in Nova Scotia, and they can trace their roots back to the Black Loyalists of the War of Independence of the United States in 1776. And that's where my particular family can trace their roots to. So the other thing, Sean, was that when the First World War broke out and when Blacks were finally allowed to join in July of 1916, the Canadian Army was worried that they would not get enough Black men to fill a battalion, a full-strength battalion, which would be about 700 men. So they accepted recruitments from all across Canada and from all across the United States.
So basically those who could not serve or were turned away from serving in the United States crossed the border and came to Canada to fight? Is that what you're saying?
No, well, when the battalion was formed in 1916, I believe that the United States didn't have joined the war back then. So a lot of Blacks found in the United States, a lot of African Americans saw this as an opportunity to go and fight in the Great War. Eventually, the United States came in, and the same thing happened in the United States. Blacks they formed all Black military units in the United States. The number 2 construction battalion was comprised of Black men from across Canada, across the United States, and as far away as the Caribbean. So this is really an international story.
That's a story I didn't even know that part of the story. And I knew about your documentary years ago. Now, so I also understand that you've developed additional materials to go with the documentary to assist educators for using as a source of education for history students. Can you tell us a bit about the other materials that you've produced?
It is a film that intertwines both personal interviews with family members and experts in the field, with archival photographs and dramatizations of particular scenes. And the film was really groundbreaking in many ways. It was one of the first films that utilized dramatic scenes in color with actual voices of the characters speaking. And it wasn't until later on that particular technique became extremely popular, especially with documentaries on the History Channel. When I was looking for money to produce the film, a lot of government agencies said, listen, it would be great, first of all, because Canada is a country of 2 official languages. A lot of the government agencies who were willing to give me money said, listen, it would be great if this was produced in both languages. So the film is not only available in English, the film was also dubbed in French. We wanted it to go to schools because we knew that this story was not in any of the Canadian history books in the schools. And so what we did was we hired educational writers to develop a teacher's resource manual to accompany the film that would allow teachers to know how to use the film in a classroom setting and how it would relate to specific subjects within the curriculum. And so we hired some educational writers. We developed a teacher's guide to accompany the film. We also produced little 60-second public service video announcements that could be broadcast on television, in creating these 60-second promos for educational purposes to be shown on television. And we later expanded that to other great African Canadian heroes and heroines, and we produced some more 30-second and 60-second public service video announcements.
If you enjoyed the show and want to see more, join our Facebook page called The Man Cave by Gentlemen United. All of our shows, tons of additional content, and invitations to future shows are posted there. You can add to the conversation and suggest future discussion topics. Please like, comment, share, and most of all, subscribe by clicking the Gentlemen United icon. I promise it's free. Thanks again for joining us in The Man Cave.
Enjoyed the show? Like, share, and subscribe. And thanks for joining us in The Man Cave.